Hey friends, tonight, let's explore the silent flight and suspicious reputation of one of the most misunderstood creatures of the medieval world, the owl. Its eyes glow in the dark, its wings whisper through the trees, and its presence once sent villagers scrambling for holy water and prayer beads. You might think it's just a bird, but in the Middle Ages, you might not survive that thought. So before you relax, take a second to like and subscribe if you find value in what we share. And let us know in the comments where you're listening from and what time you're falling asleep tonight. Now dim, the lights maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing just at the edge of the forest. The moon is out barely. Silver mist rolls low through the trees like it's got somewhere very secret to be. Every few minutes there's a rustle, maybe a rabbit. Maybe not. Then above you, something moves. You don't see it. You feel it. A soundless rush of air, like a breath held too long. You tilt your head up. Two round eyes glow down at you from a branch. Motionless, wide, not blinking, and there it is, the owl. Now, if you're a modern rational thinker, maybe you just whisper, "Wow." But if you lived in medieval Europe, anywhere between the 12th and 15th centuries, your first thought might have been, is something about to die? Because that's the thing. Back then, owls weren't just birds. They were omens, bad ones. Their cries were thought to herald death, misfortune, disease, or at the very least your cow going missing. The most feared was the barn owl. Why? Because its call wasn't a gentle hoot. It was a screech. A full-body horror movie shriek that echoed through the night like someone stepped on a ghost's toe. It didn't help that they flew silently thanks to their specialized feathers. To the medieval mind, it was eerie. Birds weren't supposed to sneak. And that silence, a sign of something unnatural. You walk through the forest path and start to notice carvings on trees. Little depictions of owls, some perched, some with wings outstretched, most with little daggers etched into their eyes. Protective symbols, you think. Or maybe warnings. It's unclear, and no one really wants to explain it in broad daylight. In folk tales whispered around the hearth, owls were messengers of witches, familiar spirits, or worse, transformed souls. Women who'd cursed the church, now doomed to fly at night and cry for the damned. You remember hearing one story. If an owl called near your house 3 nights in a row, someone in the home would fall ill. The 4th call meant they wouldn't recover. That certainly does not help you sleep better. There's an old rhyme from the 14th century, spoken in a Breton dialect, that went something like, "Where the owl sings the earth splits." Okay, sleep tight. Of course not. All fear came from folklore. Sometimes it was just timing. In an era without electric lights, anything moving through the night was cause for concern. You didn't see the owl. You heard it. And then someone died. Or a fire broke out. Or a sheep got sick. So naturally the owl became suspect. You walk further and come across a small village long abandoned. A crumbling well, the outline of what might have been a chapel, and scratched into the stone above the doorframe, an owl wings folded. Below it, the Latin nocte venit mala avis, at night comes the evil bird. But here's the strange twist: owls were also kept in some noble households as curiosities. People admired their hunting skills and ability to keep rodents in check. So while peasants hung charms to ward them off, A baron might have one stuffed in his hallway. Dual reputation, much. A few naturalists even recorded owls as sorrowful birds who preferred solitude, sounds oddly poetic for something accused of bringing plague. Speaking of plague, during the Black Death, it was said that owls were seen gathering on rooftops where the sick lay dying. Could they have sensed the decay, or were they just good at finding easy prey? Either way, the association was sealed. The owl became part of the death procession in the public imagination. You sit for a moment on a fallen log. An owl calls again, not close, but not far. The sound is strange, more like a shriek than a hoot. You can understand why someone in the dark centuries ago might interpret that as something supernatural. You wouldn't be entirely comfortable hearing it now alone. But here's the debate. Were owls feared because of their behavior, or were they scapegoats for human anxieties? Scholars still disagree. Some say the church pushed negative imagery to enforce daylight morals. Others argue fear of owls existed long before woven deep into Indo-European myths. Still others believe the owl's fearsome status was simply the result of too many sleepless nights and bad acoustics. Whatever the cause, you're beginning to feel it too. That strange, delightful tingle of discomfort. Like a story you don't quite believe but wouldn't dare say out loud in the woods. The owl stares down at you again, still not blinking. Then, like it was never there, it spreads its wings and melts into the night. Your heart skips. Your breath softens. And somewhere far off it cries once more. 3 soft chuckles before we drift off. Medieval villagers feared owls but kept ferrets in the pantry. Priorities. Someone once tried to exorcise an owl. The owl didn't respond. Naturally. If you ever hear an owl at night, remember it's probably just hunting. Or judging your life choices. Silently. Whispers in the Latin margins. You're inside a scriptorium now. One of those long, echoey monastery rooms filled with candle smoke silent monks and 1,000 hours of quiet judgment. The air smells of ink and dried herbs, and someone's humming what might be a hymn, or possibly just a 13th century version of mumble singing. You've got a vellum manuscript open before you, the page still rough beneath your fingertips. The ink is brown, probably iron gall, and the lettering is precise black letter Gothic, tight, serious, and reverent. But you're not here for the words. You're here for the margins, because in the margins, someone's been having fun, or at the very least working out some deeply personal bird-related issues. There, just beside a passage from Deuteronomy, is a small owl. It's wearing a monk's cowl. Next to it, a tiny human figure upside down pokes it with a stick. Beneath that, another owl, larger this time, clutching a scroll in one claw, and what might be a mouse, or a soul. You look to your left. The monk at the next desk doesn't react. Apparently, this is normal. You lean closer. In a different manuscript, this one, a bestiary, the owl is not cute. It's hunched, gnarled, and surrounded by black flames. The caption Strix is Latin, borrowed from even older Roman tales. According to these sources, the Strix was a night bird that fed on blood and stole infants from their cradles. Yes, that's the bedtime reading for monks in the 12th century. Strix, of course, later became the root for strigoi in Eastern Europe vampire territory. But here, it's still a bird, a weird one that no one trusts. You flip another page and find a margin note scrawled by a tired scribe. Sometime in 1197, Noctua rident in tenebris, the owl laughs in the dark. It's unclear whether that was meant as commentary on the text or just a cryptic warning to the next reader. Either way, it doesn't exactly say, "Sweet dreams." Medieval manuscripts weren't just dry theology. They were oddly expressive, especially in the margins where scribes had a little more freedom. That's where you'd find snails fighting knights, cats playing lutes, and more often than you'd expect, owls doing terrible things, like judging court trials, or wearing pope hats, or being harassed by monkeys. That last one happens a lot. But here's something curious. Despite their association with darkness and doom, owls also represented ignorance in medieval art, not wisdom. That comes later in the Enlightenment. In these older texts, the owl who can't see well in daylight is mocked as blind to true spiritual light, a creature of shadow, of confusion, possibly Protestant. Kidding. Mostly. So now you're starting to see the layers. The owl wasn't just scary because it flew. At night, it symbolized everything the church wanted to warn against: sin, secrecy, inversion of divine order. Even its silence was suspicious. Unlike the rooster who crowed at dawn, a good boy, or the dove who cooed lovingly, ideal nun energy, the owl kept to itself and refused to follow the script. Classic introvert, and in medieval society, that made it dangerous. You turn another page. This time, the margin shows a human figure with an owl's head weeping beside a tree. A Latin line underneath reads, "Et ex qui sapiens est credebat factus est bestia noctis." And behold, he who thought himself wise became a beast of the night. That feels pointed. You glance around. Still no one reacting. Still the same low hum from the far corner. Still the quiet sound of quills scratching out someone's 8th psalm of the morning. Of course, not everyone agreed with the church's owl agenda. In some southern regions, particularly among Arabic-influenced scholars, owls were considered natural marvels. Some Islamic texts, preserved in Andalusia, noted their exceptional hearing and hunting skills. One even hypothesized that owls could detect the vibrations of approaching storms. Back in the north, though, theology trumped biology. The owl remained an unclean bird, a creature of abandonment, cited in sermons as a metaphor for the soul that hides from God. Still, there's something undeniably poetic about all this. The owl as both literal and symbolic creature, as misunderstood nightbird and projection screen for medieval neuroses. You shift in your seat. The candle beside you flickers, and in that flickering light, you could almost swear the little owl in the margin just blinked. But it doesn't, because that's what makes it an owl. Here come your 3 sleepy giggles. Marginalia proof that monks were just repressed cartoonists with good calligraphy. If the owl judges you from the margin, just remember it's 800 years old and still bitter. The Strix drank blood. Modern owls. They just want a quiet mouse and no drama. Feathers of heresy. You find yourself walking the cold flagstones of a monastery courtyard just before dawn. The sky is a dusky plum. Birds not yet awake except for one. Perched on the high edge of a crumbling arch is an owl. Still, watching. It doesn't move, not even as you draw closer. Just sits there, head slightly tilted, as if it knows something you haven't confessed. A novice passing by notices you staring and mutters under his breath, "It's not a good sign." It never is. Then he tugs his robes tighter and disappears into the cloister, as if he's said too much already. You blink. You didn't expect to start your morning with avian theology, but here we are. In many monastic communities of medieval Europe, the owl wasn't just a nighttime nuisance. It was practically a red flag for heresy. Not because it could quote the wrong gospel or challenge church doctrine, but because of where and when it appeared. There's a recurring pattern in ecclesiastical reports from the 12th to 14th centuries, mysterious owl sightings near monasteries, plagued by internal disputes, doctrinal splinters, or whispered rumors of unorthodox texts being copied after Compline. Coincidence? That depends on whom you ask. According to one chronicler in Burgundy, an owl was seen perched above the scriptorium window just days before a scandal broke something about a monk secretly translating Greek pagan texts under the cover of psalms. In another case, from northern Italy, the owl was said to have screeched thrice above a chapel, where a sermon questioned papal authority. Within the week, the entire abbey was placed under investigation. Now, no one claimed the owl caused the heresy, but many believed it signaled it like a feathery nocturnal church bell, just with significantly more ominous vibes. You duck into the monastery library. Dusty shelves lean under the weight of parchment scrolls and chained books. The silence is absolute. Well, except for the occasional rustle of paper or feathers. You're not quite sure. In a dim alcove, you find an early theological treatise with a marginal note scribbled in red. Beware the owl who sees the night and not the light, for so too do heretics read by candle, not by sun. That's a strong metaphor, a little poetic, a little accusatory. Classic monk energy. Of course, the owl's ties to heresy weren't always symbolic. In some legends, witches and heretics were said to transform into owls, particularly women accused of secret rituals. One record from 1302 speaks of a trial in which a woman was seen leaving her home at dusk and returning at dawn, the owl always crying at her roof. The implication, shape-shifting, or at least deeply suspicious nocturnal behavior, as if having insomnia were grounds for theological exile. To be fair, this idea wasn't unique to Europe. In parts of Eastern Europe and Anatolia, certain nightbirds were feared as cursed beings or spirits in temporary animal-formed souls not yet judged still wandering. The owl was just the quietest among them. But back in your current monastery, fear of heresy isn't abstract. It's policy. Owls appearing near dormitories investigate for secret texts. Owls crying during Mass. Fast for 3 days. Owls nesting in the bell tower. Cancel Sunday service and consider relocating. You climb a narrow stairwell leading to the belfry. Dust coats everything. The wooden beams creak. The bell silent and massive looms above you. And nestled in a dark corner, there it is again. The same owl. Or another one just like it. A little puffed. Unbothered. Watching. You don't know whether it's here for a theological audit or just good acoustics. Then just below the owl carved into the stone with slow, careful gouges are the words, Silentium Fallax, deceitful silence. It seems someone here didn't trust the stillness or the owl. And maybe that's the core of it. Owls don't sing. They don't chirp. They watch. They withhold. In a world where words were sacred, spoken in chants, sung in prayer, etched in scripture, a silent creature was a danger, a metaphor for those who stayed quiet when they should have spoken, who kept their own thoughts, who believed without permission. And in the Middle Ages, believing differently was heresy. You exhale slowly and begin your descent from the tower, the owl's gaze never leaving you. It's not hostile. It's worse. It's unreadable. Still, some scholars argue the connection between owls and heresy was more invented than observed, a product of post hoc storytelling. Something spooky happens, blame the owl. Someone's preaching too enthusiastically about predestination, probably an owl nearby. One theory even suggests clerics used owl imagery in sermons as a subtle social control, an avian warning against wandering thoughts. So was the owl truly a threat to orthodoxy? Or was it just the bird everyone could agree to misunderstand? You're not sure. But outside now, as the sun finally breaks, over the edge of the abbey walls, you hear it one last echoing call from the tower. Low, hollow, judgmental maybe, but also oddly soothing. And now, your nightly chuckles heretical edition. Monks feared owls might spread heresy. Ironically, owls never once translated anything into Latin. If you transform into an owl to avoid church politics, you're not a heretic. You're just efficient. The real heresy, thinking the owl cares about you at all. Night hunters and moral panic. The wind is picking up as you walk along a dirt path that slices through a patch of woods just outside a sleepy hamlet. The trees creak with old gossip. The air smells like moss, and the smoke of someone's stew slowly bubbling in a distant pot. And then you hear it sharp and sudden, a screech. Not a person, not a fox, but something deeper, wilder, ancient. You stop. You wait. And then again, the unmistakable call of a barn owl slices through the dusk like a blade made of breath and bone. You feel it in your chest, like someone cracked open the sky and whispered a warning just for you. It's easy to see how things went sideways in the Middle Ages. To live in the medieval countryside was to live half in the woods, half in fear. Fear of wolves, fear of bandits, fear of that neighbor who knows too much about herbs. But most of all, fear of what moved in the dark when you couldn't see it. And no creature represented that blurry boundary between night and nightmare better than the owl. Unlike other animals that bumbled around or made cheerful chirps, the owl was precise, deadly, elegant. Its head turned like a question you weren't ready to answer. It showed up when things were about to go wrong. That's not superstition. That's pattern recognition. Right. People began connecting the dots. An owl cried, and then a fever swept through the town. An owl perched on the roof, and someone's baby didn't wake up the next morning. A pair of glowing eyes in the rafters, and the harvest failed. It didn't matter whether the owl caused these things. It was there. And in a world ruled by signs and portents, presence was enough. Welcome to Moral Panic Medieval Edition. One of the more popular folk tales from 13th century Flanders tells of an owl who haunted a village by crying from the same tree every night for a month. The people believed the bird to be the embodiment of a sinful soul. They climbed the tree, cut it down, and when the owl didn't fly away, they burned the entire grove, just in case. Weeks later, the town faced a storm and a flood. The lesson? Clearly the owl had cursed them for trying to stop its curse. Circular logic is not a modern invention. In another case, documented by a local cleric in Wales, an owl nested inside the thatched roof of a bakery. Within a fortnight, 3 villagers accused one another of witchcraft. The owl was eventually captured, beheaded, and nailed to the church door. By then, everyone involved had probably forgotten what they were originally upset about, including the owl. But the panic didn't only live among peasants. Even nobles fed into it. Some castles kept falcons for hunting by day, but paid extra to have servants patrol for owls at night. There were records of guards instructed to shoot owls on sight. You can imagine the job listing night watchmen needed must dislike birds. The most famous case, a noblewoman in Aquitaine, who swore her child was taken ill every time she heard an owl outside her nursery. She moved homes 3 times. Each time an owl found her. She wrote to a bishop. The bishop replied, and I quote, "Perhaps you should change the child's wet nurse instead." That advice did not improve owl relations. You stop now, beneath a twisted oak, its bark damp with lichen. There, in a knotted hollow, you see something white, just a flicker, a feather, a wing, or the suggestion of a bird-shaped absence. It doesn't matter, because in the minds of the villagers, the real danger wasn't the owl itself, it was what the owl meant. It meant something was wrong, that someone had sinned, that a secret was festering. So instead of questioning weather patterns or hygiene practices, they asked who had brought the owl's gaze upon them, who had called down its scream. And that's how blame worked in the Middle Ages, fast, irrational, and occasionally airborne. Still, some thinkers tried to push back. A handful of naturalists, usually cloistered monks, with enough patience and daylight, wrote that owls were simply misunderstood, that they ate mice, helped granaries, and had feathers like velvet. But those same monks would also note that too many owls in one place might disturb the balance of holy order. So not exactly a glowing endorsement. In one particularly philosophical tract, a friar argues that the owl represents humanity's fear of the unseen, our tendency to turn what we don't understand into moral danger. We do not fear the owl, he writes, but our own blindness. He was not very popular at dinner. You take a breath. The air is still again. The owl has moved on, probably hunting, or napping, or filing a complaint against humanity with the celestial HR department. And yet, the panic lingers, not in your chest, but in the soil, in the wood of the buildings, in the lull between one breath and the next. Because once a symbol sticks, it's hard to unstitch. 3 feathers of gentle nonsense. Owls were blamed for everything except bad soup. Probably because they refused to eat it too. If an owl cries outside your window, don't panic. Just assume it's judging your wallpaper. The real reason for moral panic: a lack of sleep and too much imagination. Kind of like this podcast. The owl on the scaffold. The crowd is already gathering in the square by the time you arrive. Cobblestones still glisten from the morning rain, and the air carries that curious mix of boiled cabbage incense and something metallic you can't quite place. There's a scaffold in the center, wooden, rickety, theatrical in its grimness. But your attention isn't on the noose, or the guards, or the whispering townsfolk clutching their cloaks. It's on the owl, perched high on a wooden beam, just above the executioner's platform. The bird sits motionless, feathered in pale brown, round-eyed, and of course completely silent. No one told it to be here, but no one's surprised either. In fact, someone mutters behind you. That's the same one as last time. Another crosses themselves. A third looks at the sky and mutters something about bad omens and wheat shortages. Because here, in this particular corner of medieval France, the owl has a job. It watches the condemned. It's not official, of course. You won't find judicial owl on any payroll. But after a few too many executions coincided with owl sightings, people started assuming the connection was divinely coordinated. Like the owl was part of the ritual, or worse, part of the judgment. There's a bell tolling now, slow, deliberate, and you notice the prisoner being led up the steps. A man with hollow eyes and legs that don't quite obey him anymore. Maybe he's guilty. Maybe not. You won't know. But the owl watches him, like a historian writing a final sentence, and suddenly you understand why this bird earned a reputation for doom. It was always there when things ended. It didn't screech. It didn't intervene. It just bore witness. That kind of stillness feels unnatural when everything else is trembling. A record from 1346 mentions the appearance of a blear-eyed nightbird on 5 consecutive executions, prompting the local bishop to call for a day of fasting and reflection. Not for the dead, but for the moral cleansing of the air itself. Apparently, owls were contagious now. In England, the hanging owl became almost folkloric. A rhyme circulated in Lincolnshire went, "If the owl perches above the rope, the soul shall slide, not climb the slope." Interpret that as you will. Of course, no one ever asked the owl what it thought of all this. Some scholars later argued that gallows were attractive to owls for practical reasons. They were tall. They were quiet. They were usually near open fields, perfect hunting grounds. Add in the occasional rat or leftover morsel from someone's pocket, grim but real, and you had yourself a prime roost. But in a world without data, optics mattered more than logic. The owl didn't care about justice, but justice, oddly enough, began to care about the owl. In certain trials, especially those involving suspected heretics or witches, owl sightings were entered into the official records. The accused was noted to tremble as the owl called thrice at dusk, as if the bird's presence was a form of celestial testimony, feathered circumstantial evidence. You lean against the wall of a tavern and listen as an old woman recounts how when her cousin was falsely condemned, an owl refused to land at the scaffold. "It circled," she says, as if searching for a better man to hang. The story gets quiet approval from the gathered listeners. Justice may be blind, but apparently owls are picky. What's fascinating is that even executioners developed owl superstitions. In one preserved letter from an unnamed headsman in Germany, he writes, "An owl landed upon my scaffold and would not move, not even when pelted. I performed the task poorly that day, and blood stained the stones strangely. I fear I shall not live long." He died 6 years later of gout, but the owl got the credit. You look back at today's scaffold. The deed is done. The man's soul has presumably gone wherever souls go, when everyone around you believes birds are involved in judgment. The owl hasn't moved. You start to wonder if it ever does. Then it blinks, and for some reason, that feels louder than the bell. Perhaps the owl's power didn't come from prophecy or curse. Perhaps it was simply always present. When something final happened, be it justice, injustice, tragedy, or grace, someone always spotted an owl in the corner, doing nothing but remembering. And isn't that the most unnerving thing of all? A creature that watches but never explains. You step away from the square as people begin to leave in 2s and 3s. Bread sellers shout half-heartedly. Children are warned not to stare. And the scaffold creaks slightly in the wind. The owl still and unreadable remains. 3 quiet laughs before you doze. Medieval executioners feared owls, which is ironic considering one of them invented the axe snap. If your court system depends on bird sightings, maybe skip jury duty. Owls don't blink often, not because they're cursed, but because they just can't be bothered. Barn owls and broken windows. You find yourself in the shadow of a tilted barn at the edge of a fog-draped field. The air is thick with the smell of wet hay, fermented apples, and a faint note of mildew that always seems to cling to anything made of old wood and forgotten hopes. The roof sags slightly. The door creaks when it shouldn't. And high above, just under the rafters, is a narrow window with no glass. That's where you see it. White. Still. Like a dropped piece of moonlight with a beak. A barn owl. It stares at you with that expressionless intensity only owls seem to have mastered, the one that suggests it knows your secrets, your sins, and possibly what you had for dinner 2 nights ago. The barn is quiet. The owl is not. Screech! You jump. A farmer behind you drops his pitchfork and mutters, "There it is again, that ghost bird." Then he makes the sign of the cross in a way that says, this is about the 10th time he's done it this week. You're not in a village today. You're in farmland country, where superstition and practicality go hand in hand like mismatched boots that still get the job done. And here the barn owl is both pest control and a potential harbinger of doom. A helpful threat. A feathered paradox. The farmers say that when an owl cries from a barn at night, it means something is wrong with the livestock. A cow about to die. A sheep about to birth twins. Or worse, something that can't be seen but will be known when it's too late. And yet, they don't chase the owls away. Instead, they hang little wooden crosses over barn doors, nail bits of mirror inside the eaves, burn bundles of rosemary in corners. One farmer even nailed a shoe to the rafter. To confuse the spirits, he explains. You don't question it. He's holding a sickle. You glance back up at the owl. It hasn't moved, but there's a small pile of bones below the window. Mice, voles, maybe a rat, all carefully decapitated and stacked like tiny, slightly horrifying trophies. Barn owls, you learn, are excellent hunters. Their hearing is so acute they can locate prey under snow or behind walls. Their wings are shaped for total silence. Their eyes, massive, more telescope than eyeball. If you're a rodent, this bird is death on wings. If you're a medieval peasant, hearing that scream outside your bedroom, it's a clear sign that something is definitely not okay. And oh, that scream, unlike the hoot of a horned owl or the soft call of a dove, the barn owl lets loose a shriek that sounds like someone was startled awake inside your skull. It echoes through wooden boards, through closed shutters, through small villages that were already full of nightmares. There's a story from 1293 about a village in Bohemia where an owl took up residence in a grain barn. The villagers complained of bad dreams, sick cattle, and missing spoons. No one explained the spoons. Eventually, they tore down the barn. The owl flew off. The problems persisted, so naturally they blamed another owl. You walk inside the barn. It's cooler here. Dust hangs like slow smoke in the light shafts from the ceiling. The owl shifts slightly above you, but doesn't fly. Below it, the hay rustles as a few chickens shuffle nervously. Even the animals know something about that bird isn't normal. A pig snorts in its pen. A goat blinks slowly. Everyone's pretending not to look up. In the far corner, you spot an old charm tied with red thread. A bundle of herbs, a feather, and what might once have been a bell. You recognize the intention warding off barn spirits. Owls weren't always the spirits themselves. Sometimes they were messengers. Sometimes watchers. And sometimes, if they nested too long, they were considered signs that the barn had become unclean. The church never made a formal doctrine about barn owls, of course. But that didn't stop local priests from offering owl blessings, usually involving incense Latin and light scolding. sometimes followed by boarding up the windows, which only made the owl angrier and louder. There's even a preserved letter from a 14th century friar who wrote, "The widow's fowl does not cease its crying. I suspect either witchcraft or damp rafters." We appreciate the scientific rigor. Eventually, some farmers tried to rebrand the owl not as evil, but as protective. They argued that if the owl was watching, then maybe it was guarding them. That its scream was a warning, not a curse. One man even called his barn owl Saint Screamer. You really hope he meant it affectionately. You step outside again. The sky's darker now. The fields stretch in sleepy, tangled rows. And just as you turn back for one last look, the owl is gone. No sound, no flutter, just vanished, like it was never there. But a single white feather flutters down from the window. You catch it. You don't know if that means something good or something terribly inconvenient. But the pig seems relieved. 3 snoozy chuckles from the barn. Barn owls scream like banshees, but at least they're tidy murderers. Medieval villagers nailed shoes to the rafters, which means someone was definitely walking around with just one. If your barn comes with complimentary omens, it should at least come with better insulation. The herbalist's bird. It's dusk, and you're walking through a narrow lane on the edge of the village, the kind of lane that seems to exist more in rumor than on any map. The path is muddy, overhung with hawthorn, and every few steps, your cloak catches on something thorny. No one else is out, which makes sense, because you're heading toward her house. The herbalist. People call her many things. Most of them whispered. A few of them mumbled with reverence. One child, with jam on their face and no sense of fear, once called her the Leaf Lady. But most villagers don't go near her unless they're desperate. And even then, they don't linger. You reach her gate. A rusted iron hook, a few dried plants strung like offerings, and a single bell made of bone. You knock. The door creaks open not by hand, but by its own tired hinges, and perched on the lintel above the door is a barn owl. Pale, immobile, watching. Of course, inside, the air is thick with rosemary damp clay, and something vaguely medicinal, like honey gone bitter. The herbalist doesn't speak right away. She gestures for you to sit, then returns to her mortar and pestle crushing what might be dried nettle, or might be just about anything. The owl follows you with its eyes. Not a blink, not a sound. And then the herbalist finally speaks. You heard it last night, didn't you? You nod. The scream, another nod. She smiles half in amusement, half in sympathy. That's not for you, she says, but it knows your name. You don't ask what that means. Now, in most villages, having a pet owl, especially one that lives with a woman who speaks to plants, is a fast-track invitation to accusations. Witches in medieval Europe didn't always ride broomsticks or stir bubbling cauldrons. Sometimes they were just smart women with a suspicious bird, and that was enough. There are court records from 1321 in which a woman was accused of summoning spirits through the assistance of a ghostly fowl. When pressed for details, the townsfolk described the bird as white silent and glowing about the eyes. That was all it took. In some towns, laws were passed forbidding women from keeping nocturnal animals. Cats, ferrets, owls. One lord even insisted that no creature that blinks less than once a minute should be allowed within city walls, which sounds oddly specific and slightly petty. But herbalists like this one, they didn't care for walls or rules. They lived at the edges, literally and socially. And sometimes they raised owls not for magic, but for mice. You watch as the owl hops down from the rafters and lands lightly beside a bowl of water. It dips its beak drinks and then very deliberately hops closer to you. Just once. Then stops. The herbalist watches this amused. It likes you, she says, or at least doesn't not like you. That's rare. You try not to take that personally. Outside, the trees creak in the wind. A dog barks. Somewhere, a church bell tolls 6 times sharp, distant and faintly threatening. Then the herbalist leans in and whispers, "There's an old belief that owls can carry messages. Not written, not spoken, just felt. They hear what we don't. They follow death not to cause it, but to warn of its shadow." That's beautiful. Also deeply unnerving. In one manuscript, you vaguely remember seeing at the monastery library, there was an illustration of a woman, uncloaked, arms-raised owl on her shoulder, standing at the edge of a battlefield. No armor, just feathers and fire. The caption simply read, "She who sees the fall." You ask the herbalist if that's how people see her. She shrugs. "They don't see me at all. They see the owl. And that's enough." You sip something warm she's placed in your hands. It tastes like cinnamon and something faintly numbing. As the room softens around the edges, you glance up at the owl again. It's moved to the windowsill, watching the path you came from, like it's expecting someone else to arrive. Or something. Outside, wind rattles the shutters. A branch taps twice, then again. You look to the herbalist. She nods. Once then begins sorting her jars with practiced calm. She's expecting company, and not the friendly kind. In some parts of medieval Europe, villagers believed that witches sent owls as spies. Others said the owl's cry was the first note of a curse. A few went so far as to claim that an owl landing on your roof meant your name had been written in someone's book. A bad book, but here it feels different. Not evil, not kind, just watchful. You stand to leave, and the owl watches you from the window. Still no sound, just breath, and the faint echo of something old and feathered moving just beyond the veil. 3 oddly herbal chuckles for the night. Medieval owl policy: if it flies at night, it's a spy. If it stares at you, it's a witch. If it poops on your hat, well, that's just rude. A barn owl drinks more mice than mystery, but good luck explaining that at your trial. If your neighborhood herbalist has a bird, don't panic. Just ask if it does appointments. When Rome meets the forest, you're walking now through the remains of something once proud and imperial. The stones beneath your feet are older than the village nearby, older than the forest that's slowly reclaiming them. Ivy drapes over broken columns. A once majestic arch is now more suggestion than structure. And somewhere in the underbrush, a fox is watching you with the same look an innkeeper gives when you ask if the soup is truly fresh. This was once a Roman outpost, an extension of empire law and geometry into a land full of mist wolves and inconvenient beliefs. But time has folded it into the forest like a note no one wants to read again. And that's where you see it, carved into a chunk of worn marble, half covered by moss. An owl, its stylized, symmetrical round eyes, wings folded with mathematic precision. The Roman kind. Below it, the Latin still lingers, sapientia in silencio, wisdom in silence. You pause, because that's different. In Rome, owls were symbols of knowledge, of Minerva, of insight that sees through the dark, not just literally, but philosophically. Where medieval villagers saw doom, Romans saw dignity. Where peasants heard screaming ghosts, Romans heard a teacher whispering in the dark. So what happened? How did this creature go from sacred companion of a goddess to unholy warning posted on rooftops? The short answer, forests. The long answer, cultural context and centuries of theological rebranding. When the Roman Empire began to fracture, especially in the West, its symbols didn't disappear. They just got repurposed. The owl went from being a symbol of divine wisdom to a thing that appeared in forgotten places. Pagan ruins, abandoned shrines, edges of villages that feared what they couldn't name. And when Christianity spread across the continent, it brought with it a new lens, a light over darkness worldview. The day became good, the night became suspect. So any animal that thrived in darkness became, well, suspicious. The owl tragically didn't rebrand fast enough, but even in medieval texts, echoes of Rome remained. Some scribes referred to the owl as Minerva's bird, though rarely with praise. In one awkwardly passive-aggressive sermon, a priest warned against the pagan bird of secrets, who hoots not in praise, but in private counsel, which is church speak for stop being weird and reading alone. You find a crumbling wall nearby, half-eaten by ferns, and run your hand along its edge. There are faint marks scratched in later, less refined hands. One is a cross, one is a crude owl, and one is a sword pointed downward. A quiet conversation across centuries. What's fascinating is that in some of the early Christian texts, particularly those from the desert hermit's owls, were occasionally praised for their solitude. Saint Jerome described the owl as a creature of the wilderness, one who, like the monk, removes himself from the noise of the city and listens only to the voice of God, which sounds noble until it became just one more reason to suspect monks of weird hobbies and potential witchcraft. Back in your timeline, you sit down on a fallen Roman column, the moss pleasantly cool. You imagine what it must have been like to be a Roman soldier stationed out here, writing letters home, keeping watch, hearing an owl cry in the night, and thinking, ah, the goddess sees me. Only for that same cry, 200 years later, to make a villager bolt their shutters and clutch a rosary. One sound, two meanings, a world apart. And so it went. The owl fell from grace, not because it changed, but because we did. Civilizations tell stories through animals. Rome needed symbols of thought and vision. The medieval world needed warnings. And so, the owl did what owls do best. It watched and waited while we rewrote its role. Even now, centuries later, it still sits quietly in the trees, bearing all our projections, wise, wicked, sacred, cursed, without ever saying a word, which frankly feels like emotional labor the owl never asked for. You stand again. The forest hums. A soft breeze rustles the ferns, and from far off, just faint enough to be half imagined, you hear that familiar cry. Not a scream this time. A low, rounded hoot. It echoes through the stones, and for once you don't feel afraid, just watched in a good way. 3 owlish chuckles to carry home. Romans loved owls for wisdom. Medieval villagers loved to run from them. We call that historical mood swing. If Minerva's owl walked into a medieval tavern, someone would throw salt at it. The owl didn't change. We just swapped its PR team for one with a much darker aesthetic. When Rome meets the forest, you're walking now through the remains of something once proud and imperial. The stones beneath your feet are older than the village nearby, older than the forest that's slowly reclaiming them. Ivy drapes over broken columns. A once majestic arch is now more suggestion than structure. And somewhere in the underbrush, a fox is watching you with the same look an innkeeper gives when you ask if the soup is truly fresh. This was once a Roman outpost, an extension of empire law and geometry into a land full of mist wolves and inconvenient beliefs. But time has folded it into the forest like a note no one wants to read again. And that's where you see it, carved into a chunk of worn marble, half covered by moss. An owl, its stylized, symmetrical round eyes, wings folded with mathematic precision. The Roman kind. Below it, the Latin still lingers, sapientia in silencio, wisdom in silence. You pause, because that's different. In Rome, owls were symbols of knowledge, of Minerva, of insight that sees through the dark, not just literally, but philosophically. Where medieval villagers saw doom, Romans saw dignity. Where peasants heard screaming ghosts, Romans heard a teacher whispering in the dark. So what happened? How did this creature go from sacred companion of a goddess to unholy warning posted on rooftops? The short answer, forests. The long answer, cultural context and centuries of theological rebranding. When the Roman Empire began to fracture, especially in the West, its symbols didn't disappear. They just got repurposed. The owl went from being a symbol of divine wisdom to a thing that appeared in forgotten places. Pagan ruins, abandoned shrines, edges of villages that feared what they couldn't name. And when Christianity spread across the continent, it brought with it a new lens, a light over darkness worldview. The day became good, the night became suspect. So any animal that thrived in darkness became, well, suspicious. The owl tragically didn't rebrand fast enough, but even in medieval texts, echoes of Rome remained. Some scribes referred to the owl as Minerva's bird, though rarely with praise. In one awkwardly passive-aggressive sermon, a priest warned against the pagan bird of secrets, who hoots not in praise, but in private counsel, which is church speak for stop being weird and reading alone. You find a crumbling wall nearby, half-eaten by ferns, and run your hand along its edge. There are faint marks scratched in later, less refined hands. One is a cross, one is a crude owl, and one is a sword pointed downward. A quiet conversation across centuries. What's fascinating is that in some of the early Christian texts, particularly those from the desert hermit's owls, were occasionally praised for their solitude. Saint Jerome described the owl as a creature of the wilderness, one who, like the monk, removes himself from the noise of the city and listens only to the voice of God, which sounds noble until it became just one more reason to suspect monks of weird hobbies and potential witchcraft. Back in your timeline, you sit down on a fallen Roman column, the moss pleasantly cool. You imagine what it must have been like to be a Roman soldier stationed out here, writing letters home, keeping watch, hearing an owl cry in the night, and thinking, "Ah, the goddess sees me," only for that same cry, 200 years later, to make a villager bolt their shutters and clutch a rosary. One sound, two meanings, a world apart. And so it went. The owl fell from grace, not because it changed, but because we did. Civilizations tell stories through animals. Rome needed symbols of thought and vision. The medieval world needed warnings. And so, the owl did what owls do best. It watched and waited while we rewrote its role. Even now, centuries later, it still sits quietly in the trees, bearing all our projections, wise, wicked, sacred, cursed, without ever saying a word, which frankly feels like emotional labor the owl never asked for. You stand again. The forest hums. A soft breeze rustles the ferns, and from far off, just faint enough to be half imagined, you hear that familiar cry. Not a scream this time. A low, rounded hoot. It echoes through the stones, and for once you don't feel afraid, just watched in a good way. 3 owlish chuckles to carry home. Romans loved owls for wisdom. Medieval villagers loved to run from them. We call that historical mood swing. If Minerva's owl walked into a medieval tavern, someone would throw salt at it. The owl didn't change. We just swapped its PR team for one with a much darker aesthetic. Scrolls and screeches. You're tucked into the corner of a narrow stone chamber, surrounded by parchment rolls, beeswax candles, and a librarian who blinks exactly once every 7 minutes. The air smells like dust and warm ink. Someone's humming a Gregorian chant a few rooms over, but you can't tell if it's live or just the building remembering. The scroll before you is fragile, its edges curling inward, like it's trying to hide its own contents. You unravel it carefully, revealing rows of neat Latin script diagrams of human organs, and near the bottom, something unexpected. An owl, drawn hastily, screeching, its beak-wide wings raised in alarm eyes, like 2 little panic buttons. Below it, a label Avis pestifera, the plague bird. That's new. You ease the scroll open further. Next to the owl is a drawing of a fevered patient bedridden, sweating, surrounded by tiny devils and oddly expressive rats. It's a medical text, all right, or at least a medieval attempt at one, which, to be fair, sometimes involved as much prayer as poultices. Apparently owls made the cut. It turns out that in more than a few medieval medical scrolls, especially those penned during or after waves of the Black Death owls, were mentioned not just as metaphors or superstitions, but as warning signs. Physicians, yes, real ones, with degrees and semi-clean hands, recorded owl cries as environmental indicators of illness. Like an early terrifying version of the weather forecast. If the owl cries thrice above the roof, one text reads, "The red plague shall pass within 7 days." You look around, there are no owls here. Good, but back then, people noticed patterns, or what they thought were patterns. Owls called more often during outbreaks, especially in warmer months. Of course, this could be because humans were staying indoors more, leaving prey animals to scurry freely in the fields. More food equals more owls. Simple ecosystem math. But to medieval minds, the logic was reversed. Owls didn't come because of rats. They came before the illness. Because they knew. You flip to another scroll. This one is written in a regional dialect, something between Latin and local guesswork. It features a story about a village healer who tracked illness by mapping owl sightings. She would sit near the well, eyes closed, and listen. When she heard the first screech, she began boiling herbs. When she heard the second, she locked her door. When asked why, she simply said, "The owls come for breath before breath is taken." A little dramatic, but compelling. Modern scholars debate whether there's any scientific basis to this. Some argue owls, with their hypersensitive hearing and acute vision, might have responded to subtle environmental changes like rodent population booms or the smell of decay from ailing livestock. Others say this is classic post-plague myth-making, assigning meaning to a creature already steeped in mystery. And others still, they think it was all projection, that we needed something to blame besides fleas and trade ships. You run your finger across the margins. Someone scribbled a note. Heard 3 cries last night. Lit candles. Slept in boots. That's one way to prepare. You can't help but admire how thorough the fear was. It wasn't just random people panicking. This belief seeped into recorded practice. Some healers included owl appearances in their diagnoses. One treatise lists owl cry, at window alongside blackened lymph and unquenchable thirst, which seems unfair to the bird, but very on brand for 14th century diagnostics. Back in the chamber, the librarian shuffles past, carefully balancing a pile of wax tablets. You think about asking them if they've read the owl scrolls, but they shake their head before you even speak. They're not for interpretation, they say. They're for remembering. You nod, pretending that makes perfect sense. Outside now, the sky is just tipping toward evening. Somewhere across the village square, an owl cries. Not a hoot, a proper barn owl screech. The kind that turns heads and tightens stomachs. You count 1. You wait. No second call comes. Just the soft shuffle of someone closing shutters across the street. You exhale. Maybe we never feared the owl itself. Maybe we feared that it noticed things before we did. That it saw what was coming and didn't stop it. Just watched. Maybe that's what makes the screech so chilling. It's not a warning. It's a confirmation. 3 cough-free chuckles to unwind. Owl-based diagnostics. Medieval health cares. If it hoots, you're doomed approach. If your doctor checks your pulse, and the trees maybe get a second opinion. The real plague wasn't the rats. It was our need to blame birds with anxiety issues. The children's rhyme. You're walking now through a village near the end of harvest season, where the air tastes like chimney smoke and boiled pears. Children chase one another between hay bales, giggling like they've never heard of taxes or winter. But as twilight deepens, something shifts. The game's slow. The parents call them home with that unmistakable medieval tone, equal parts gentle, and do not make me come out there. You duck into the shelter of a low wooden awning beside the bakery. It smells like cooling rye bread and scorched oats. And just past the oven, chimney perched on a wooden crossbeam, is, you guessed it, an owl. It's smaller than the barn owls you've seen before. Rounder, less judgmental in the eyes, but still completely still. Then a child walks past you, singing under their breath, just loudly enough to catch the words. If the owl sings thrice tonight, lock the doors and hide the light. First, it cries for what is near. Second time, for what you fear. Third, it calls for what you've lost. Count the crows and pay the cost. You freeze. The child doesn't. They just skip onward, humming cheerfully, as if they weren't reciting a prophecy of doom baked into a nursery rhyme. In the Middle Ages, children's rhymes weren't always child-friendly. Some were riddles. Some were memory devices for saints' feast days, but many were warnings. Coded bits of folklore that wrapped fear inside rhythm like a sugar-coated curse. And owls, oh, they featured prominently. One common Germanic lullaby from the 13th century went, sleep now, hush your eyes, else the owl will hear your cries." Night belongs to silent wings, and stolen breath the screecher brings. Delightful. This wasn't because medieval parents were especially cruel. It was because they genuinely believed the world was unpredictable, dangerous. And one way to prepare your child for that was to sing them a reminder every night before bed. And the owl, silent, sharp, untouchable, made the perfect bedtime antagonist. In parts of rural France, owls were called les oreilles du diable, the devil's ears. Children were told that if they whispered secrets after sundown, the owl would carry them straight to a dark forest where lost souls wandered in circles. Harsh, but effective. You pass a cottage where a group of children are drawing with chalk on the stones. One picture shows a person with an exaggerated head and stick limbs standing under a tree. Beside them is a floating shape, round, winged, and screaming. A parent peeks through the window and gently tells them, "That's enough for today. No more owl games." No more owl games. That phrase sticks with you because apparently pretending to be an owl, or drawing one after sunset, or even mimicking the call too accurately could earn a child a whispered scolding or a hurried blessing. Not because the owl would come, but because it might already be listening. This level of folklore surveillance might sound absurd, but to a medieval village, every pattern mattered. If your family had a run of bad luck, someone would always ask, "Did your boy cry out like an owl last week?" Or, "Was there one seen above your house?" The owl became a measure of unease, a way to externalize dread. And children still new to the idea of dread learned early how to name it in song. One recorded chant from a Welsh village went, "Owl in rafters, owl in tree, leave my brother come for me. I have bread and I have bone, let him sleep and me alone." That's the kind of rhyme that makes you wonder just how much kids actually understood and how much they simply inherited from generations of whispered fear. You step into the square as the sky shifts from plum to charcoal. Lanterns begin to flicker behind windows. One child stays outside a moment too long, staring into the tree line. Then far off, an owl cries. They bolt, you almost do too, but instead, you close your eyes and listen. One cry, then nothing. Maybe the rhyme won't continue tonight. Maybe tonight, the owl just needed to remind you it's still there. Still part of the stories you tell your children when the night feels a bit too large. Because in the end, the owl isn't the villain. It's the keeper of the tension, the thing that lets the song have teeth, the shadow behind the lullaby. And every good story, even one whispered through a cracked cottage door, needs a little shadow. 3 hoots of bedtime mischief. Medieval children didn't have cartoons, but they had owls and trauma. So, even trade. If your bedtime rhyme includes instructions for death avoidance, it's probably not soothing. The owl wasn't trying to haunt your dreams. It was just really into performance art. The owl and the executioner. It's nearly midnight now, and the world feels like it's holding its breath. You're standing near the edge of a clearing, where the trees thin just enough to let the moonlight spill in like a silver secret, too lazy to hide. In the center of the space, beside a lone stump, worn smooth by time and repetition, stands a man. He's not armored, not robed, not especially tall. He's the executioner. He sharpens his blade with slow, methodical strokes. The kind of pace that doesn't come from pride or nerves, but from habit. His hood is folded beside him on a rock, You get the sense he's off duty, though, with executioners. That line is blurry. And then it comes. Soft, deliberate. Who? He doesn't look up. You do. Perched just above, on a low branch, is an owl. Round. Observant. And alarmingly quiet for something you know can scream like a banshee if it really wants to. It watches the executioner like it's reviewing his resume. Not judging, just auditing. The man finishes his sharpening, sets the blade down, and finally speaks. That one comes to watch every time. You blink. He doesn't elaborate. For some reason, you don't ask who because you already know. The owl, the silent partner in so many of these nighttime performances. And tonight the executioner is telling stories. There was a boy once, he says, didn't deserve the rope. Everyone knew. But the judge was in a mood, and the church agreed so. He taps the hilt of the axe. Duty. He doesn't say what happened to the boy, but he does say the owl cried once that night. Just once. Then flew away. Quiet. Like it knew it wouldn't need to stay long. You sit on a nearby stone. It's colder than it looks. The association between owls and death isn't new to you. But hearing it from the person who swings the blade, that adds something unsettling. Executioners in the Middle Ages were strange figures, feared, needed, occasionally shunned. Some towns made them live on the outskirts away from clean society. Others gave them housing in return for silence. But all of them, in one way or another, were part of the machinery of order. And owls, apparently, they were always present. Some headsmen reported seeing owls at executions, particularly ones held at dusk. A few took it as a blessing nature's approval. Others found it unnerving. One letter from a 15th century French headsman describes an owl circling overhead during a beheading and landing on the executioner's cart afterward. It stared at the blood, he wrote, then looked at me as though comparing. You imagine that's not a moment easily forgotten. The man beside you pulls his hood over his head, not to leave, but to think. They don't scream at the scaffold, he mutters. Only before, days before. That's how you know it's going to be one of those. You raise an eyebrow. The ones who scream, who pray too loud, who weren't ready. He says it like it matters. And maybe it does. Some believed the owl's cries were tied not just to death, but to the manner of death. That a calm passing drew no call, but injustice that brought out the full choir. It's not exactly a scientific theory, but in a time when signs mattered more than cause, it felt real. You ask him if the owl's ever changed its routine, if it ever skipped a night. He shakes his head. No, but sometimes it arrives late, as if deciding. And then he says something you don't expect. I think it's not here for them. You look at him. I think it's here for me. He stares at the bird with an expression you can't quite read. Reverence, resentment, a bit of both, maybe. I think it keeps watch, not to witness death, but to see if I change. Now that is a thought you'll take with you into sleep. The idea that the owl isn't a harbinger, but a mirror. A feathered memory that shows up, not for the dying, but for those left behind, who must carry the doing. The owl blinks once slowly, then without ceremony, it spreads its wings and drifts into the darkness. You don't hear it leave. That's the most owl thing about it. The executioner picks up his blade, wipes it clean, even though it never got dirty tonight, then walks back into the trees without another word. You're left alone in the clearing. The moon's moved on. The shadows are softer now, less judgmental. You breathe And for the first time in a while, you're not entirely sure if the owl is gone or just somewhere you can't see it. Either way, it's probably watching. 3 quiet chuckles before your dreams arrive. Executioners feared owls, but never faulty stares. Priorities. If the owl shows up early, maybe cancel your dramatic last words and just whisper an apology. Owls the only court observers who never get summoned, but always show up. Feathered familiars. The sky tonight is the color of damp wool, muted, heavy, and uninterested in letting stars peek through. You're in a village square that doesn't appear on any maps, the kind that only reveals itself if you walk without purpose for long enough. There are no lanterns, just the faint orange glow from shuttered windows and the soft hush of people trying not to be noticed. And yet in the middle of this carefully quiet place, you hear a flap of wings. Slow, intentional. You look up. There, sitting on the edge of a tavern roof, is an owl. Large, pale, silent as the moment before a question. It's not moving, not hooting, just watching. And everyone is ignoring it very, very hard. That's the first sign you're not in an ordinary village. The second sign, a cloaked figure emerges from an alley with a gloved hand held aloft. The owl doesn't hesitate. It drops down, lands with a whisper of feathers, and folds itself into the person's arm like it was always meant to be there. No one screams. No one gasps. But the tavern door shuts a little faster than it needs to. You follow at a respectful distance because obviously and soon you find yourself in the company of the Owl Watchers. They don't call themselves that, of course, not out loud. But this group, cloaked careful and mostly silent, meets once a month under the new moon. Their stated purpose, to observe the behavior of local owl populations for ecological and spiritual significance. Their actual purpose, to quietly keep an eye on people who might be flirting with the edge of accepted religious belief. In a time when the line between folk practice and heresy was thinner than the thread in a nun's embroidery needle, people like this walked a delicate path. They didn't worship owls, but they did believe that owls noticed things others missed. Changes in the air, shifts in luck, the difference between a lie and a regret. And sometimes they believed the owl didn't just symbolize that awareness, but carried it. This is where the idea of the familiar comes in. In medieval Europe, particularly during witch hunting periods, familiars were believed to be animal companions granted by demonic or magical means. Cats were common. Frogs, weasels, and goats had their moment. But owls were perfect for the role. They were nocturnal, independent, and often appeared near people who lived alone or knew too much about herbs. Basically, if you were a woman with both a garden and a bird, congratulations, you were now in league with forces unknown. There's a case from 1445 in what's now southern Germany where a woman was brought to trial, accused of sending her owl to eavesdrop on council meetings. The charge, avian espionage. The evidence, the owl once perched on the windowsill during an argument about taxation. Ironically, the owl probably knew more about economics than half the council. But the idea stuck. Owls didn't just watch. They carried intention. That's why you now find yourself seated in a candlelit attic above a cobbler's shop, surrounded by scrolls, feathers, and a large, content-looking owl named Jorund. No one knows why he's named that. No one asks. One of the owl watchers tells you that their birds aren't pets. They choose us, she says, like that explains everything and nothing at once. If they stay, it means you're listening right. You don't know what you're supposed to hear, but you try anyway. The room is quiet. The owl blinks. Its feathers rustle, then settle. For a moment, it feels like the air itself is paying attention. You glance at a parchment on the table covered in notes written in looping shorthand and smudged charcoal. It's a chart of owl cries. One hoot, someone tells a lie. Two screeches, a promise broken. A low hiss, betrayal, but not yet discovered. Is it accurate? Almost definitely not. But is it useful? Absolutely. Because in a world full of hidden motives and suspicious blessings, having a system, even one involving suspicious birds, gave people a sense of control. And if that system involved an owl perching dramatically before a family scandal broke out, all the better. You sip something warm and spiced from a wooden cup, handed to you without explanation. It tastes like time bark and possibly regret. The woman beside you smiles. We don't make magic, she says. We just notice things before they get loud. And maybe that's the key. The owl wasn't always a messenger of doom. Sometimes it was just the village's unofficial therapist. The watchful presence that knew when something was off, even if it didn't say it out loud. You finish your drink. Yoren blinks again. Somewhere outside, another owl calls. The group pauses, counts, then continues their meeting like nothing happened. But you know something did. 3 hushed hoots to end your night. If your pet owl keeps showing up at secret meetings, maybe don't name it after your ex. Medieval spy networks had pigeons. Owl watchers had better posture and cooler accessories. Familiars weren't evil. They just had strong opinions and very little patience for sermons. Eyes of the devil. The chapel is empty tonight. The candles have burned low, the incense long since faded into the stone. You sit near the back pew, the wood hard beneath you, worn smooth by centuries of anxious bottoms and whispered prayers. Outside, a storm gathers, not a loud one, not yet. Just enough wind to make the shutters complain. And across the chapel, carved above the altar window, is an owl, not the soft, wise library type. This one has claws, raised wings, flared, and most unsettling of all eyes that never close. Painted black, rimmed in red, with no eyelids carved at all. Always open, always watching. It was added later, someone tells you. Not part of the original church, they murmur, but put there during the pestilence. A warning. You look closer. Not a symbol of grace or wisdom, but of surveillance. Condemnation. A spiritual security camera with talons. In the Middle Ages, to have eyes that didn't blink was not considered miraculous. It was considered unnatural, inhuman, and in some cases, infernal. That's where the owl's reputation took another dive. The idea that the owl's unblinking gaze mirrored the devil's own watching eye, cold, constant, without mercy, spread quietly but effectively. Preachers warned their congregations not to look too long into the trees after sunset, lest the devil see you see him, because you see, blinking was human. Blinking was gentle. It suggested trust fatigue, even grace. But the owl didn't blink. It stared. And in a time when being stared at too long was suspicious enough to get you accused of sorcery, imagine what it meant when a bird did it. There's a sermon preserved from a 14th century friar in southern France titled simply De Oculo Diaboli, of the Eye of the Devil. In it, he speaks of the owl as the quiet demon of the rafters and warns that where it fixes its gaze, wickedness will root. That seems a bit harsh for something that eats rodents, but the symbolism was powerful. The owl's eyes, large and forward-facing, reminded people of things that watched but did not sleep. And in a world already brimming with suspicion of neighbors of the forest, of one's own thoughts being watched, felt like a divine test, or a demonic trap. You walk toward the altar, head tilted back, studying that carved owl. Its expression hasn't changed in hundreds of years, but you swear the shadows around its beak deepen just slightly. No one could quite agree what the owl was, guardian or spy. Some believed it perched between worlds' eyes open, so it could see both the mortal realm and the spiritual one at once. Others said it was cursed to witness every sin, unable to look away, and that's why it screamed. That last part might have just been poetic guilt. In some Eastern European texts, particularly from border villages, where Orthodox and Catholic ideas blended uncomfortably, the owl was called the night confessor because it heard every secret mumbled to the dark. Not that it forgave, just that it knew. And if that's not unsettling bedtime theology, I don't know what is. There's a tale from a German town near the Rhine where a statue of an owl was found in the crypt beneath a church. One eye black, the other red. When asked why it was placed there, the elder priest simply said, "To remind the sinners what sees them." No one asks what else was in that crypt. Now you sit quietly as the storm outside grows louder. The owl above remains still. And yet you find yourself blinking more often, as if to break eye contact, as if you're the one being judged. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the owl didn't earn its association with evil through anything it did, but through what it didn't. It didn't blink. It didn't sleep. It didn't forget. And in a world desperate for forgiveness, that made it terrifying. Because what if some part of the world never stops watching, not out of malice, just out of design? The owl didn't close its eyes because it couldn't. And maybe that's what made it feel like a devil. 3 slowly blinking thoughts to end with. If medieval people feared unblinking creatures, how would they feel about statues, dolls, or your very intense cat? The owl's real sin. Outstaring monks during long prayers. Sometimes the eyes of the devil are just tired birds with good focus and bad press. The owl that watched the plague. You're standing in a field that used to be a village. The houses are gone, reduced to moss-covered outlines on the ground. The well is dry. The paths, once trampled by hundreds of feet, are now overgrown with thistle and forget-me-nots. Even the grave markers have slumped like they're too tired to keep secrets. And above it all, perched on the cracked beam of a half-collapsed bell tower, is an owl. It doesn't move when you arrive. It doesn't fly away. It just sits still as memory, exactly where it's always been, if the stories are true. Because they say this owl came here when the dying began and never left. You're in what used to be St. Grimald's Hollow, a modest settlement in the Low Countries, wiped out during one of the many waves of the Black Death. Most records of the place are gone. But the owl made it into the stories, again and again. People say it cried the night before the sickness arrived, that it landed on the village cross, turned its head full around, and screamed 3 times, that a child saw it, pointed, and asked if the bird was praying or warning. No one had an answer. The next morning, the first fever began. Of course, plague is spread by rats and fleas, not owls. But in the 14th century, nuance was less important than narrative. And the narrative was, when the owl comes, death follows, and not just once. Similar tales echoed across Europe. In England, villagers near York claimed that an owl perched on a widow's windowsill the night before she buried her entire household. In Tuscany, a chronicler noted that barn owls nested in the steeple above the convent, where half the sisters perished in the span of a week. In Prague, a monk wrote that an owl keened at the convent wall, and no bell needed ringing thereafter. Was it coincidence? Or were people simply more attentive to signs once the worst began? Maybe both. You step through the ruins of what might have been a chapel. Just an arch remains framing the sky like a forgotten halo. In the soft light of early evening, you catch another movement, two more owls now. Smaller. One settles into the corner of a collapsed barn roof. The other circles lazily, then glides to rest atop the well. Three owls, watching. There's a superstition in certain medieval regions that the number of owls seen at dusk could predict the depth of loss. 1 owl illness. 2 death. 3 grief that lingers. You feel a chill that has nothing to do with the wind. Interestingly, some physicians of the time began recording owl cries in their plague logs, not because they believed owls caused disease, but because the bird's appearance became so commonly reported by frightened patients. One even wrote, "Before the boils rose, they heard the bird sing." Medieval medicine wasn't exactly known for its subtlety. Still, it wasn't all fear. A few sources hint at a different reading of the owl, as witness, not curse. In one monastery, a healer scribbled this beside a list of burial rites. The owl cried, but did not enter. It does not flee the dying. It only stays to see it through. There's something heartbreakingly dignified about that. Perhaps the owl wasn't a harbinger, but a mourner, a quiet attendant to those who passed without comfort or kin. A bird that stayed when others turned away. You step outside the chapel again and glance back at the bell tower. The owl is still there. Head slightly turned, feathers ruffled, just so by the wind. You try to imagine it, then this exact field 700 years ago. Smoke rising, bell tolling, families afraid to speak, and through it all, this bird silent, unblinking, observing as the world shifted from order to grief. Maybe that's what the owl truly represented, not doom, but witness. The last to leave, the one who remembers. And if that's the case, maybe we got it all wrong. Maybe calling it cursed was our way of not admitting we just couldn't bear to be watched while we failed each other. You stay a little longer. The sun dips lower. The owls don't leave. Neither do you. Not yet. 3 quiet echoes to ease your heart. Blaming owls for the plague is like blaming the moon for the tide, technically present, not technically guilty. If the owl sees you sick, don't panic. Just ask if it brought soup. The real horror: medieval towns with more owls than doctors. Carvings in the choir loft. You're in a church now. Not grand and gilded, but narrow and lean, with thick stone walls and wooden beams darkened by candle smoke and the slow passing of centuries. The pews creak when you walk past them. The incense is long since gone, and above the altar, faintly visible in the morning gloom, is the choir loft. It's quiet. Too quiet, maybe. You step lightly up the narrow staircase, boots, careful on uneven steps, polished by generations of hesitant feet. Up here, the world feels farther away. The loft is low-ceilinged, snug, just wide enough for a few voices, a few instruments, and one long bench. But it's not the bench that catches your eye. It's the carvings beneath it, along the edge of the wooden paneling, hidden where only the most bored chorister or curious maintenance monk might notice, is a series of small figures, crudely but deliberately etched. Animals, people, angels, and in the center of it all, an owl. At first it looks ordinary. Round head, forward eyes, wings tucked neatly. But then you notice the owl is not alone. It's flanked by two tiny demons, one perched on its back, the other curled around its talons. You lean in. This isn't decorative. It's symbolic, and it's unsettling. The owl here isn't just a bird. It's a host, a vessel, a middleman between the visible and the unseen. In this context, it becomes not merely a watcher of sin, but perhaps a conduit of it. Welcome to the theological imagination of the late medieval church. Choir lofts were supposed to be sacred space, elevated, set apart, a place where voices met heaven halfway. But they were also where artisans, bored monks, and woodcarvers slipped in their own commentary, moral, satirical, and occasionally unhinged. You've seen them before marginalia in physical form, foxes dressed as bishops' rabbits, jousting cats, conducting funerals for mice. But the owl always returns in more serious company. In many churches, owls appear in woodwork, surrounded by darkness, clutching scrolls, or staring down from corners where no one looks unless they're really, really trying not to fall asleep during Mass. And they often share space with figures of temptation. In this particular carving, the owl's eyes are painted with a dark red pigment, faded but still visible. Someone wanted them to stand out. Someone wanted you to notice that this bird sees more than it should. There's a theory among some art historians that owls in choir lofts were reminders to those singing sacred music: be careful where your mind wanders. The owl watches, and so does what lives beyond it. Cheerful stuff. You trace a finger lightly along the carved feathers. The detail is surprisingly delicate, each line a whisper from a craftsman who probably had a lot of theological opinions and nowhere else to put them. There's a fragment of a Latin phrase burned faintly into the wood nearby. Cantus sin corde et vox noctuae. A song without heart is the voice of the owl. Ouch. Apparently to sing without devotion was to sound like a creature of night, empty, echoing, possibly cursed. It's a harsh comparison. But you can see the logic. The owl's call doesn't uplift. It doesn't harmonize. It startles. It mourns. And in a church that prized order, beauty, and holy resonance, the owl's wild alien voice might have felt like a threat, like dissonance in a place built for unity. You sit for a moment on the old bench, looking out over the nave. It's beautiful from here, humble. Dust dances in the light shafts like tiny incense ghosts. And yet behind you, the carved owl remains. You don't feel threatened, but you do feel seen. And that's the whole point, isn't it? The owl carved into the choir loft isn't there to haunt you. It's there to ask, are you really singing for the right reasons? Or are you just making noise? It's not a punishment. It's a reminder. Even sacred spaces need a touch of uncomfortable truth. 3 quiet chuckles to sing you to sleep. Nothing says focus on your hymn like a wood-carved owl silently judging your pitch. If your choir loft has demons and birds, congratulations, you've unlocked medieval multitasking. The owl wasn't the devil's bird. It was just the original sound engineer. The bird in the bestiary. You're sitting cross-legged on the floor of a monastery library. One of those libraries where time breathes differently. It smells of old parchment candle wax, and that particular kind of mildew that insists knowledge should come with mild respiratory risk. Before you, resting on a wide wooden lectern, is a bestiary, and not just any bestiary. This one is illuminated, which is to say, illustrated with painstaking, gloriously weird images painted by monks who had clearly seen maybe one lion in their entire lives and decided, That's probably what it looks like. You flip past dragons shaped like oversized lizards, elephants, with the emotional range of guilty cows, and a beaver who is, surprisingly, well armed. And then near the back, between a two-headed snake and a deer that cries tears of incense, you find it. The owl, perched stiffly on a branch, painted gold, surrounded by curling vines and ominous Latin. The colors are faded, but vivid enough deep brown plumage, enormous eyes, and what might be a small halo, or possibly just an accident of gold leaf. Beneath the image, a caption in red ink reads, Noctua avis obscura, quae fugit lucem et amat sordis. The owl, a dark bird, who flees the light and loves filth. Charming. This was the standard medieval depiction of the owl in bestiaries, a creature of darkness, solitude, and moral ambiguity. Not necessarily evil, but certainly suspicious. Definitely not invited to brunch. You lean closer. The accompanying passage goes on to explain that the owl represents those who reject divine truth, that its preference for night over day is symbolic of sinners turning away from God, that its dwelling in ruins and hollow trees proves its affinity for decay, both physical and spiritual. The owl, in short, is not having a great PR moment. But here's the twist. The actual behavior of owls is quite clean. Many species meticulously preen their feathers, clean their nests, and raise their young with a level of dedication that would put some medieval landlords to shame. So where did the slander come from? Blame allegory. In the Middle Ages, bestiaries weren't just zoological guides. They were moral instruction manuals disguised as animal facts. Every creature had a lesson. The ant taught diligence. The lion stood for Christ. The pelican, which people thought fed its babies with its own blood spoiler, it didn't become a symbol of sacrifice. And the owl was for the outsiders, the avoiders, the too silent, the too smart, the ones who kept strange hours and made other people uncomfortable. You know, night people. The bestiaries doubled down. Some described the owl as blind in daylight false. Others claimed it couldn't stand holy sounds rude. A few even suggested it nested in tombs and slept upside down, extremely creative, also false. But no matter the details, the message was clear. Don't be like the owl. And yet, despite all this symbolic baggage, the image of the owl remains strangely compelling. The artists who painted them never made them grotesque. In fact, many gave them elegant lines, rich colors, and backgrounds of gold leaf. It's almost as if, even while condemning the bird, they couldn't help admiring it. You turn the page. Another owl. This one is flying over what looks like a battlefield. Below, tiny figures with spears and banners march in disarray. The owl glides high above, distant, untouched. The caption, Avis quae videt sed non vult intercedere. The bird who sees but does not choose to intervene. Oof, that hits harder than expected. Because maybe that's the real anxiety here. Not that the owl is evil, but that it's indifferent. That it knows what's coming, sees the mess, hears the lies, and still doesn't make a sound until it's far too late. Not out of cruelty, just because that's what it does. It watches, and maybe we needed it to care more than it could. You close the bestiary slowly. The binding creaks. A bit of gold leaf flakes onto your sleeve. You stand and stretch joints, complaining softly. The sun has dipped lower in the sky outside. The library's gone dim, and somewhere in the rafters, you swear you hear a faint hoo. Not a screech, not a scream, just a soft, hollow echo. Maybe a question, maybe a reminder, or maybe just a tired bird wondering why humans keep blaming it for their own discomfort with shadows. 3 polite hoots before bed. Medieval bestiaries come for the animals, stay for the unrelated moral judgment. The owl wasn't dirty. It just didn't live in cathedrals. So apparently, that made it suspicious. If your entire worldview collapses because a bird prefers nighttime, maybe the owl isn't the one who needs introspection. Evil by association. The fire in the tavern hearth is low tonight, barely holding its shape, like even the flames are tired of this century. You're seated in the far corner, where the light doesn't quite reach, listening to the kind of silence that only exists between village gossip and another round of ale. A man 2 tables over leans in and says, "They buried him with the owl, you know." That catches your ear. You shift slightly enough to listen, but not enough to make eye contact. Another voice, a woman's, this time answers. "In the same pit." He nods. "Same pit, same sheet." Said the bird never left his shoulder, not once. Stayed with him, even after the soldiers came. The table goes quiet after that. No one says the man's name. But from the way the room breathes around it, you understand he was a traitor, or at least someone accused of it. And that owl, well, that bird's reputation just got a bit worse. You're hearing the tail end of a common medieval pattern when a person's perceived evil starts staining everything around them. Family, tools, house, animals, especially owls. In a society obsessed with signs and associations, the owl was an easy scapegoat. Already nocturnal, already silent, already drawn to places others avoided. All it took was one wrong perch or one unfortunate friendship, and suddenly the bird was in on it. There's a record from Burgundy, dated 1384, in which an entire household's possessions were burned after a heretic's conviction, including a stuffed owl mounted above the hearth. The reasoning: too many nights had it been seen during the man's prayers. Yes, burned for loitering. In another case, from Hungary, a nobleman fell from favor after siding with a local rebellion. When soldiers stormed his estate, they found letters, coins, and most damning of all, a trained owl that sat quietly on his windowsill. They called it his winged spy. The owl was executed. Unclear how. Possibly theatrically, but the real tragedy, none of this was the owl's fault. They were just there, and presence was enough to convict. You stir your mug. The tavern is warmer now, the voice is louder. Someone sings half a drinking song before forgetting the lyrics and switching to humming. And above it all, you keep hearing whispers of owls. He had one. It perched near her garden. I saw it when the sheriff vanished. These weren't tales of magic. Not always. More often, they were tales of bad luck. Guilt by proximity. The owl didn't cast the spell. It just happened to be watching when the spell was cast. But that was enough. It's human nature, really. We want to make sense of misfortune. We want evil to leave clues. We want to believe that if we just notice more, we'll be safe next time. And the owl always seemed to know something. You finish your drink and step outside. The night is quiet. You hear the last echoes of boots on cobblestones and shutters being pulled closed. A soft wind stirs the air. And then somewhere nearby, a low hoo. You look up. There it is, not perched ominously, just sitting calmly on the signpost of the tavern, watching. And for a flicker of a second, you wonder, what have you done that the owl might remember? What secrets have you muttered under your breath that it might have overheard? What names did you not say out loud at your table, but thought with a little bitterness? You exhale, The owl blinks slowly, then looks away as if to say, "You're not worth the parchment ink." Fair. But that's the heart of it, isn't it? The owl didn't need to do anything. It just had to be present, nearby, associated. In a world that feared hidden enemies, anything associated with shadow and silence became suspect, and the owl unfairly and unforgettably bore that burden. 3 associations not to take personally. If someone owns an owl and a conspiracy, the bird's not a co-conspirator, it's just tired. Medieval justice system. If your pet looks too smart, consider running. Owls weren't guilty by action, just by really unfortunate seating choices. The Queen's Owl. Tonight, you're in a place where the stone doesn't feel like stone. It feels like money that's had a long nap. Welcome to the castle. The halls are quieter than expected. Tapestries rustle with a draft you can't find the source of. Footsteps are muffled by rugs so thick you could lose small livestock in them. And just beyond a gilded arch, past a pair of anxious guards who pretend not to notice you, is the royal aviary. Not the falconer's tower. This one is different. More personal. More secret. Inside, lit only by firelight, and a single stained glass window depicting Saint Hildegard looking very unimpressed with everyone you find her. The Queen, not as majestic as the paintings make her seem. Right now, she's sitting on a carved wooden bench, dressed in a robe far more comfortable than royal. And on her shoulder, an owl, a small one, round-faced, snowy white, with the quiet confidence of a bird who's definitely been whispered about behind its back. "You're not supposed to be here," the Queen says, without looking at you. You don't reply, because frankly, this isn't about you. She turns, and now you can see the faint smile, part pride, part defiance. "They told me to get rid of her," she says, gesturing to the owl with a slight tilt of her cheek. "Said it would disturb courtly order." You raise an eyebrow. It hooted during the Archbishop's sermon. She continues, "I considered that a contribution." The owl remains perfectly still. Apparently it agrees. This isn't just a pet. It's a statement. In the rigid hierarchy of medieval court life, everything had a purpose. Hawks for hunting lapdogs, for display doves, for diplomacy. But an owl was an anomaly. A wild card. A symbol of nighttime solitude and personal judgment in a world obsessed with appearances. Naturally, the courtiers hated it. There are rumors recorded in court chronicles, very delicately phrased, about the Queen's preference for creatures of the dusk, which sounds like a poetry reading, but was absolutely intended as slander. They said the owl was a bad omen. They said it cried before the king fell ill. They said it perched on the princess's cradle and refused to blink for 6 hours, all of which is impressive and statistically unlikely. The Queen, however, didn't care. She had the owl brought to her chambers at night, fed it scraps of duck and candied almond, read aloud to it during long winters. It sat quietly during debates, tilted its head at ambassadors, and once reportedly pecked a duke who got too loud. That last part might be apocryphal, might not. Still, the pressure grew. Her confessor urged her to consider the spiritual implications. Her ladies-in-waiting whispered about the eyes. The royal steward filed an official complaint that the presence of the owl has decreased morale in the pantry. How he measured, that no one knows. Eventually, the Queen was summoned before council, an owl in tow. One noble declared, "It is unbecoming for a Christian monarch to harbor a creature so long associated with ruin." To which the Queen replied, without looking up from her embroidery, "So was the raven, and yet it fed a prophet." Silence. Even the owl blinked at that. "You look now at the bird perched on her shoulder, feathers catching the stained glass light like moonlit velvet. It doesn't hoot, doesn't twitch, just is. And that really is the issue. The owl doesn't explain, doesn't flatter, doesn't adjust to expectations. In a court full of symbols that perform banners, gestures, smiles, the owl simply watches. And no one, not even royalty, likes to be silently evaluated. You ask the queen if she still hears complaints. She nods. Every week. And every week I send back a note. What does it say? She shrugs. The owl stays. A pause. Then she adds, besides, she's more loyal than half the council. Fair. You take your leave as the queen returns to her bench, whispering something you can't hear. The owl closes its eyes for just a moment. A blink. A gift. Outside the castle feels less intimidating now. Less polished. More human. Because somewhere, inside its stone belly, a woman keeps an owl. Not because it's expected, but because it isn't. And in a world built on appearances, that might be the bravest choice of all. 3 regal chuckles to rule your dreams. If an owl hoots during your sermon, maybe take the hint and wrap it up. The queen's owl wasn't ominous. It was just overqualified to be in that council meeting. Owls, less about omens, more about making powerful people deeply uncomfortable in silence. Cloisters and superstitions. You're walking through the cloister just before dawn, when the world is gray and half invisible. The stone arches above you, drip with condensation. Your footsteps echo in a rhythm too sacred to interrupt. Somewhere behind one of these walls, monks are stirring quietly. Of course, because nothing ruins a divine schedule like clattering sandals. But you're not here for them. You're here for the carvings, because this cloister, serene, disciplined, and entirely unimpressed with worldly affairs, hides something unexpected in its corners. Owls, small ones, tucked into the curves of columns, perched above doorways, and most curiously, always facing away from the center. One crouches above the entry to the scriptorium. Its wings are folded, but its head is turned sharply, watching something beyond the archway, as if it's eavesdropping on secrets whispered not in words, but in thoughts. You pause beneath it. The monk guiding you through the grounds says without turning, that one's named Augustine. We don't name most carvings, but that one earned it. You nod, obviously. The presence of owls in monastic architecture is a curiosity not often spoken of aloud. They don't appear in formal theology. They rarely show up in hagiographies unless someone needed a quick metaphor for moral decay. And yet carved into choir stalls, marginalia, and cloister columns they perch, always there, never quite explained. You step into the herb garden, a square of stillness tucked into stone. The monk speaks again. They were put there to keep watch. That's what we tell the novices, but no one really knows. And that's the thing, isn't it? No one really knows. The owl, in this place of order and divine repetition, represents everything just beyond understanding. It doesn't belong in the neat boxes of sin and salvation. It flies at night. It eats quietly. It doesn't care for applause. It's spiritually inconvenient. Yet somehow, it made its way into the spiritual heart of monastic life. Some speculate the owl served as a reminder to the brothers that even within these holy walls, temptation watches, that you are never unobserved, not by your brethren, not by God, and not by the night. Others believe the carvings were warnings to demons. We see you. And the owl was simply the best stand-in they had for a being that knew the dark and wasn't afraid of it. One particularly poetic theory: the owl was there as a silent intercessor, watching for the moment a monk's mind wandered too far, then gently tugging him back to discipline through sheer unsettling stillness. You pass a stone basin used for ritual washing. Above it, an owl carved into the arch, flanked by two fish. Symbolism unclear, highly suspect. In one 13th century monastic letter, a novice asked his abbot why there was an owl over the chapter room door. The abbot replied, "Because the truth is spoken inside, and something must carry it to the dark, which is either deeply wise or deeply creepy, possibly both." The tension between the sacred and the strange is old. The church cloister is built for rhythm chanting, studying, gardening, copying texts, repenting, repeating. The owl, it doesn't repeat, it reacts. You find a final carving near the exit. This one is different. The owl's wings are spread, eyes half closed. And just beside it, delicately carved into the stone, is the Latin phrase, custos silentii, keeper of silence. You blink. That's the most accurate job title the owl has ever been given. Because maybe it wasn't fear or suspicion that brought the owl into these holy spaces. Maybe it was respect. Maybe someone centuries ago looked into the night and thought not demon, but witness, not threat, but guardian of what must not be spoken. You exit the cloister. The sky is lightening now, turning the world back on. Birds begin their chorus, but the owls are quiet. Their shift is over. For now, 3 cloistered chuckles for reflection. Monks carved owls into stone because saying temptation exists out loud was too spicy. If the owl above the chapel door blinks, it's probably just dust or divine intervention. Owls in cloisters weren't evil. They were just the original accountability partners. From omen to icon, you're standing in a dusty university library now. Well, technically, it used to be a monastery, but somewhere around the 16th century, someone swapped out the monks for professors and the chanting for academic grumbling. The stone arches are the same. So are the drafty windows and the pervasive scent of ink and suspicion. Only now, instead of scripture, the shelves are stuffed with philosophy, natural history, and someone's half-finished dissertation on beetles. But one thing hasn't changed. The owl is still here, not in the rafters this time, but on a pedestal near the entrance cast in bronze. Polished, proud, wearing that same expression it's always had, none at all. The caption at its base reads simply, Sapientia, wisdom. And just like that, after centuries of superstition judgment and side-eye theology, the owl has made its comeback. Not as a demon, not as a harbinger, but as a symbol of intellect, a complete brand reversal. How did this happen? The short version, the Renaissance rediscovered the Greeks. The long version, everyone got tired of dying of plague and decided maybe it was okay to like books again. During the Middle Ages, owls were painted in bestiaries as creatures of moral decay. But in ancient Greece, they had been sacred to Athena, goddess of wisdom, and war, arguably the patron of multitasking. The owl, in that context, wasn't bad luck. It was insight, foresight, a creature that could see what others couldn't. And when the Renaissance thinkers came across those old Greek texts, they dusted them off, squinted at the Latin margins, and said, wait, the owl is the smart one. Naturally, this confused a lot of churchmen, but the shift stuck, slowly, through art poetry, and eventually academic emblems. The owl became fashionable again. This time, not perched on the roof of a haunted barn, but sitting calmly on the shoulder of reason. Quiet, yes, but now admirably so. Its solitude wasn't a sign of darkness anymore, but of independence. It had simply been ahead of its time. In 1498, a new bestiary was printed in Paris. In it, the owl was still described as nocturnal, still aloof, but no longer condemned. Instead, the commentary noted, "Let the owl remind us that the wise do not fear the shadows, but learn to navigate them." And just like that, centuries of suspicion began to soften. Of course not. Everyone was convinced. Superstition doesn't evaporate with one flattering woodcut. There were still towns where an owl's cry would send old women reaching for the rosary. Still villages where a white owl meant someone was about to die, get married, or be visited by a tax collector, which in medieval terms were equally terrifying. But in courts, universities, and increasingly secular cities, the owl began appearing in new ways. On crests, in books, as part of emblems for societies of learning. One school in the Low Countries even gave its professors a silver owl brooch to wear during lectures. According to one account, a student once whispered, "He who wears the owl must never speak nonsense." A lofty standard, often unmet. You walk deeper into the library, past a hall of portraits. All the usual suspects, noble noses, stiff collars, eyes that follow you, whether you want them to or not. But look closer, hidden in the background of three of them, almost faded into the oil paint. An owl, in the shadow of a chair, on a windowsill, carved into a book spine, subtle, but deliberate. By the Enlightenment, the owl was firmly back on its pedestal, both figuratively and, as you saw earlier, quite literally. From omen to icon, from feared outsider to academic mascot, it's a redemption arc worthy of any medieval ballad. And yet, you can't help but wonder if the owl itself noticed. If after centuries of being blamed for death, disease, heresy, and ruined crops, it suddenly realized it was now being printed on university seals and applauded for its mysterious dignity, or if it just kept watching, silently, unbothered. After all, the owl never changed. We did. We just finally stopped needing something to blame and started needing something to admire. And so the owl rose, same wings, same eyes, same midnight schedule, but now with the title of wise. It must have been so confused. 3 academic chuckles for the scholarly nap ahead. The owl went from devil's feathered spy to dean of wisdom faster than most students pick a major. Turns out, the owl didn't need rebranding. It just needed everyone to finish panicking. Medieval villagers feared the owl's scream. Renaissance scholars gave it a desk and tenure. The last cry of the owl. You're back where it began now. The forest is quiet. Not unnaturally so, just calm. Honest. The kind of stillness that only exists after centuries of stories have settled into the roots. Trees sway gently above you like tall, leafy librarians. The moss under your boots is soft, forgiving. And somewhere just ahead, you see it again. The owl, perched on the same crooked branch you remember from before. Eyes reflecting the moonlight like silver coins. The same tilt of the head. The same breathless silence. Except now, you hear more in it. Not menace, not judgment, just presence. You sit beneath the tree and watch for a while. No need to move. No need to name it anything other than what it is, a bird. With feathers, and history, and more patience than most kings. So many centuries have passed since this owl, this species, This shape, this symbol, first drew the suspicion of people who feared what they didn't understand. It has been the villain in rhyme, the spy in trial, the demon in the rafters, and the reluctant mascot of scholars. And through it all, it never changed its tune, because the truth is, the owl doesn't care what story you tell about it. It just keeps doing what owls do. It watches, it waits, it hunts in silence, and returns to the shadows before anyone remembers to ask why. You think back over the places you followed it: village squares and monasteries, plague fields and royal halls. Every whisper, every superstition, every confused child and suspicious priest trying to turn a creature into a metaphor, trying to cage a thing that was never meant to explain anything, only to be. And maybe that's where the owl's power lies. It refuses to perform. It refuses to be neat. It isn't the villain. It isn't the hero. It's the quiet in-between, the observer, the creature that shows up at the edge of meaning and simply sits there until you're brave enough to meet its gaze. You look up again. The owl blinks once, and somewhere in that slow, heavy blink is the closing of 1,000 chapters. Not an end, just a pause. Just the bird reminding you that all stories eventually fall asleep. And as if in response, it lifts its wings slow and deliberate and rises. No sound, no flourish, just air and feathers parting ways. It vanishes into the dark trees just as the first breeze of dawn ripples through the leaves. You listen, you wait, and then far off, but certain you hear it. Ho, one last cry, not a warning, not a curse, just a final note on a long, strange melody. And you smile, because the owl didn't bring nightmares. It just stayed long enough to keep you company in the dark. 3 final thoughts, soft as feathers. The owl wasn't trying to frighten us. It was just tired of being misquoted. If you see an owl tonight, don't panic. Just nod. It's been through a lot. We feared it because it watched in silence. Turns out silence was the one thing we needed most. But maybe that's what makes it special. Not its silence, not its scream. It stayed.